Hi! Welcome to the Cozy Nook. Settle in, relax, and together let's enter a world that is full of wonder, is sometimes mysterious, and can even be sinister. In a land far, far away, where magic is endless and dreams always come true. Or do they? I'm your narrator, and today we delve into the fascinating lives of real princesses. When we think about princesses, we think only of glamour and fancy gowns, lovely crowns and jewels, grand ballrooms with handsome princes, and the grandeur of palaces, of castles, kings and queens. However, the truth is, real-life princesses don't always live an easy life. Under the veil of luxury hides a life that is not to envy, and some even end in tragedy. Today, I read to you the story of a real-life princess, Queen Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France. The Empress's daughter, Marie Antoinette. Tears filled Antoinette's pale blue eyes. The Countess of Brandeis was tying her hair back much too tightly. Antoinette didn't blame her governess, though. It was Mama who expected her to look her best at all times. Now the blonde hair could be out of place for the concert that afternoon. The 7-year-old Archduchess Antoinette liked listening to music, but today she wanted to play outside with her older sister, Caroline. They would soon be leaving Schönbrunn, the Austrian royal family's summer home. Antoinette much preferred this honey-colored palace with its exotic rooms decorated in the bright colors of faraway India, to the ancient Hofburg Palace in Vienna. She and Caroline spent hours exploring Schönbrunn's gardens or visiting its small private zoo. But for the next 3 hours, they would be trapped inside. Antoinette sat down beside her 10-year-old sister in the beautiful hall of mirrors. Caroline was fidgeting, as always. Then she screwed up her face and began imitating the squeaky voice of an elderly lady-in-waiting, until her mother sternly swept into the room. Empress Maria Theresa looked like the ruler of a powerful empire. Their father, Emperor Francis, was just the opposite. He winked at them before cheerfully giving the signal for the concert to begin. A 6-year-old boy sat down at the harpsichord and immediately caught everyone's attention. In 1762, Vienna was the music capital of Europe. Stars of the ballet, opera, and symphony regularly visited the city to entertain the Austrian court. The empress, who had inherited her love of music from her father, made sure that each of her 8 daughters and 4 sons took music lessons. Antoinette played the harp. She could tell that the boy at the harpsichord, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, was a much better musician than any of the imperial children, even 21-year-old Joseph, her oldest brother. "What a little wizard," Emperor Francis exclaimed. He asked Wolfgang if he could play with the keys covered by a sheet. He could. Could he play with one finger of each hand? He did that too. Then, following his performance, Wolfgang jumped onto the Empress's lap, flung his arms around her plump neck, and kissed her on the cheek. Everyone waited in silence to see what Her Imperial Highness would do, but she just laughed and told her newest discovery to go and play with the other children. As they were all running through a drawing room, Wolfgang slipped and fell on the highly polished floor. The older children laughed, but Antoinette felt sorry for him and helped him up. "You are kind," he told her. "When I grow up, I will marry you." 3 years later, Antoinette needed comforting herself. On August 18, 1765, Emperor Francis died suddenly. In the weeks following his death, Antoinette had long worried talks with Caroline, sometimes about their gentle father, whom they missed very much, but mostly about Mama. In her grief, the Empress acted like a different person. She had always worked very hard running the empire. Now she didn't seem to care, and she talked of becoming a nun. On her instructions, all the walls of her rooms had been painted black. She had then told the servants to prepare a coffin for her to be placed beside the Emperor's in the royal burial vault. The Countess of Brandeis and Madame Weber, Antoinette's old nurse, tried to keep Antoinette's life as normal as possible after her father's death. Growing up in the 2,500-room Hofburg Palace had never, of course, been normal. More than 2,000 servants took care of the palace and its occupants. Before the emperor died, the royal couple used to hold spectacular dinner parties for 10,000 people at a time. Now Antoinette sat in her room and wondered if anything exciting would ever happen again. Even the family's cozy theatrical evenings when the children would sing or play their instruments had come to an end, and her lessons went incredibly boring. One of her older sisters had once described an archduchess school day. From 8:30 on, penmanship, reading, spelling, Holy Mass at 10 o'clock, French lesson at 11 o'clock, dinner at noon, 3 times a week from 2 to 3, Father Richter, a priest who taught religious studies. On the other weekdays, this hour for maps, some history, some books and fables, needlework, and the like till 4 o'clock. No wonder the Countess of Brandeis often took pity on Antoinette and cut her lessons short. Once, she had written out her lazy pupil's schoolwork in pencil and let her trace over it in ink. The Empress called her daughter sacrifices to politics. Although a brilliant ruler herself, she didn't believe they needed a good education. After all, they wouldn't inherit the crown as she had. They would become the dutiful wives of foreign princes and kings. These men would, in turn, become friends and allies of the Austrian Empire. In 1768, the King of Spain asked Maria Theresa to pick one of her daughters as a wife for his son, the ugly and dim-witted King of Naples. To Antoinette's horror, 14-year-old Caroline was chosen. Knowing her future son-in-law's faults, the Empress wrote, "So long as Caroline fulfills her duty toward God and her husband, even if she is to be unhappy, I will be pleased." The new bride was miserable. Their mother had forbidden Caroline to write to Antoinette, probably afraid that gossipy letters would fall into the wrong hands. In 1768, Caroline wrote to her former governess saying how much she missed Antoinette. "When I think her fate may be like mine, I would like to write her entire volumes on the subject." Caroline already knew that her favorite sister had been chosen to marry the heir to the French throne, Louis Auguste. France had been Austria's enemy for more than 150 years, but Maria Theresa now believed Prussia and England posed bigger threats to her empire. She signed a treaty with the French king Louis XV and offered Antoinette as the most tender pledge of the happy union between our states. As the future Queen of France, 14-year-old Antoinette quickly became the center of attention at the Austrian court. A French hairdresser fussed over her high forehead, the result of years of pulling her hair back too tightly. A French dentist straightened her crooked teeth. A French dancing instructor taught her how to walk in short little steps, like the women at the royal palace of Versailles. In their wide hoop skirts, they appeared to float above the marble floors. And finally, a patient French tutor tried to help Antoinette make up for the time she had spent ignoring her schoolwork. For a year, the young teenager wondered what her future husband looked like. Her mother had sent portraits of her daughter to the King of France, but had received none of Louis Auguste in return. When 2 finally did arrive, Antoinette hung one of them in her sitting room. The oil painting showed a plain-looking 16-year-old boy. She hoped he was more handsome than the portrait suggested. On April 21, 1770, after an exciting whirlwind month of masked balls and banquets to celebrate her engagement, Antoinette looked around her bedroom in Vienna for the last time. All her traveling clothes for the 23-day trip to France had been loaded onto the coaches, as well as a few precious keepsakes and her little dog. No one familiar except her French tutor would be going with her. When Madame Weber appeared at the door, Antoinette ran into her arms. "Dear nurse, I shall love you all my life. Do not forget me." Madame Weber and Antoinette walked arm in arm down the long hallway and outside into the bustling courtyard. When she saw her mother waiting with the rest of the family to say goodbye, Antoinette burst into tears. She knew she would probably never see them again. France was too far away. After a last hug, Antoinette climbed into an elegant satin-lined carriage. It had been sent by the King of France to carry the new Dauphin to meet her fiancé and his family for the first time. The procession of coaches moved slowly through the old walled city. 15-year-old Antoinette couldn't stop crying, and the stench of manure and garbage on Vienna's narrow streets was, as always, unbearable. She slumped against the red velvet cushions, holding a scented handkerchief to her nose. Then she jumped up suddenly to hang out the window for a final look at her beloved home. I saw a huge cortege arriving. It was the king who had the goodness to come and surprise me. As soon as I saw him, I threw myself at his feet in great confusion. He took me in his arms, kissing me again and again, calling me his dear daughter, wrote Antoinette in a letter to her mother after meeting Louis XV. The king was amused by the new Dauphine's friendliness and charm. He introduced Marie Antoinette, as she was now known, to his grandson, Louis Auguste. The awkward 16-year-old gave the pretty young girl he would be marrying in 3 days a shy kiss on the cheek. She looked up at him and smiled. Sadly, the portrait hadn't lied. He wasn't the prince of her dreams, but he wasn't a monster either. She felt a little sorry for him. The Dauphine's parents and grandmother were dead, but other members of the French court stepped forward to meet Marie Antoinette. As the introductions continued, the Comtesse de Noailles sighed heavily. One did not run up to the King of France as though he were a favorite uncle. By ignoring the court's strict etiquette rules, Marie Antoinette made her first enemy at court, her ill-tempered lady-in-waiting. No one had prepared Marie Antoinette for her new life in a palace of treachery, hatred, and revenge, as one Austrian diplomat described the Versailles court. Unlike Empress Maria Theresa, the spoiled 59-year-old Louis XV didn't believe his job was to serve his people. He could hunt deer, he could make coffee, and he could take the top off a soft-boiled egg in record-breaking time. That was about it. Meanwhile, his advisors ran the country, although not very well. France was in a state of financial ruin, its overtaxed citizens unhappy. For the most part, the 3,000 aristocrats at the French court served themselves rather than their country. The beautifully dressed nobles and their ladies competed for the most prestigious titles and for various rights. For example, the right to live in one of the 226 apartments in the Château de Versailles. They hatched plots and spread lies about their enemies. In the chapel, waiting for the royal wedding to begin, they chattered endlessly about the young bride and groom. One guest wrote, "The Dauphine was very fine in diamonds. She is very little and slender." The Dauphin appeared to have much more timidity than his little wife. He trembled excessively during the service and blushed up to his eyes when he gave the ring. Poor Louis Auguste. He wanted to be a farmer or a locksmith, not the heir to the French throne. Unfortunately, he had no choice. Louis XV disliked his clumsy grandson, so naturally Louis Auguste grew up self-conscious and unhappy. And he learned nothing about governing France. Even Madame du Barry, his grandfather's mistress, called Louis pudgy and dirty. He tried to forget his troubles by eating huge meals and hunting all day. Even after he married Marie Antoinette, this was how he spent his time. Faced with a husband who ignored her, the homesick Marie Antoinette turned to Louis Auguste's unmarried aunts, Adelaide, Victoire, and Sophie. She visited them every morning and afternoon. The king had cruelly nicknamed his plain middle-aged daughters Rag, Piggy, and Snip. They spent their days poking their noses into everyone else's business. In drawing the new Dauphin into their circle, the jealous sisters saw their chance to play a more important role at the palace and to get back at their father's powerful young mistress, Madame du Barry. Marie Antoinette played right into their hands. She was confused by the king's relationship with his mistress. After all, her mother had immoral people like du Barry chained to pillars at the city gates. It is pitiful the weakness he has for Madame du Barry, who is the stupidest and most impertinent creature, she wrote her mother. Marie Antoinette stayed out of the king's way as much as possible and refused to speak to Madame du Barry. This suited the sisters just fine, although it annoyed Louis XV. Next, the cunning aunts offered to take Marie Antoinette's place receiving visitors at court. The gullible teenager thought Mesdames were simply being kind. They knew that holding court did not interest her. Behind Marie Antoinette's back, though, they gleefully told all her secrets, and Adelaide called her l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman. This was a double insult because chien in French means female dog. Marie Antoinette's father would have seen right through this meddling threesome. He had once warned his daughter that princesses were surrounded by a crowd of people who seek only to flatter their taste and to entice them. At the Austrian court, the practical empress had done away with many formal court rituals, but at the French court, Marie Antoinette had to take part in several throughout the day. Something as ordinary as washing her hands in the morning had to be done in the correct French way, and anyone could watch. The immense palace was a public building, and during these ceremonies, the royal family was on show. Marie Antoinette couldn't seem to do anything right. She giggled during solemn occasions. When she had nothing to do, she sometimes made fun of people with other young members of the court, just as she and Caroline used to do at home. She tried to hide her smiles and laughter behind a fan, but she still offended many older women from important families. The loathsome Madame de Noailles corrected her so many times each day that Marie Antoinette soon began calling her Madame l'Etiquette. One day, Marie Antoinette fell off a donkey in the palace grounds. Servants tried to help her up, but she gaily waved them away. "Leave me on the ground. We must wait for Madame l'Etiquette. She will show us the right way to get up having fallen off a donkey." Madame de Noailles was just as displeased with the Dauphine's behavior in private. Marie Antoinette's dirty apartment was at the top of her list. Marie Antoinette now had 2 small dogs, and she let them climb up on the expensive furniture in her bedroom, library, and large sitting rooms. The dogs had never been trained, so the servants constantly ran after them, cleaning up their messes. Marie Antoinette didn't understand why this should be a problem. Many of the thousands of people milling about Versailles every day urinated in the hallways because there weren't enough privies. Next on the list was the Dauphine's appearance. Marie Antoinette refused to let her ladies-in-waiting tie her into a corset. This lace-trimmed, whalebone, stiffened piece of underwear dug into her ribs. "It was indecent not to wear one," complained Madame. "Not wearing one will ruin your figure," wrote Mama. Finally, Marie Antoinette's snubbing of Madame du Barry worried everyone, except Louis Auguste and his aunts. The king's mistress had powerful friends at court who hated the alliance with Austria. Empress Maria Theresa needed the support of France. She couldn't afford to have her daughter ruffling any feathers. Marie Antoinette bowed to her mother's wishes and spoke, just once, to Madame du Barry. She looked forward to the day when she would become a queen of France and would be able to do or say whatever she liked. On a spring day in 1773, Marie Antoinette stood on a balcony of the Tuileries Palace in Paris. It overlooked a large formal garden. "What a crowd!" she exclaimed. "Madame, here you have 200,000 lovers," said the nobleman standing beside her. Marie Antoinette and Louis Auguste were taking part in a traditional celebration called the Joyous Entry. Louis XV was growing old and feeble. Before a king died, his heir made the 2-hour trip from Versailles to meet his future subjects in Paris. Thousands had walked through the night from nearby villages to enjoy the festivities. They crowded into the grounds of the Tuileries, hoping to catch a glimpse of the pretty 17-year-old princess in her richly decorated gown and her 19-year-old husband. The young couple seemed to promise a new future for the country. But could this carefree girl and her clumsy husband successfully rule France when they came to the throne? Her mother was afraid they couldn't. The Empress wrote to her French ambassador, "I count her halcyon days as over." Sadly, she was right. Just 20 years later, Marie Antoinette stood on a blood-soaked platform and looked across the square at the Tuileries Gardens and Palace. Below her, a very different crowd elbowed and shoved one another, hoping to get a final look at the last Queen of France.